We're hoping our program will go until about 7:30, and then we'll head into breakout rooms. And so conversation can pick up then, questions can be answered. And right now, I just want to turn things over to Amy Lang. You probably know her as a court observer at umn.edu, and she's going to tell us what's going on here. Amy, over to you.
Hello, and thanks, Michelle. And I remembered to unmute before I started talking. So I'm just grateful that everybody's here, and actually with some gratitude that we can do this on Zoom, because I don't know anybody who has a big enough house. So I'm gonna share some slides to really give just a picture of what we do in court and what we produce. And Teresa will be my handy assistant. So the Immigration Court Observation Project started in 2017, and it's a collaboration between the Advocates for Human Rights, the James H. Binger Center for New Americans at the University of Minnesota Law School, and Robbins Kaplan LLP. And since the project started, over 700 people have volunteered in court, and we have documented over 9,000 observations. And if you want to go to the next slide, Teresa. If she can get it to go to the next slide. There we go. Immigration Court Observation Project draws on the international human rights practice of trial monitoring, which fundamentally serves to underscore the right to a fair and a public trial, because justice can't happen in the darkness. Next slide. Before I go further, I want to say that you'll be on all these slides seeing artwork, and we have two artists who've been sketching in court, Anita White and Nancy Olison, and I think they really bring to light the human toll of immigration court, but also just the chaos and confusion and the overwhelming nature. So at its core, the Court Observation Project is about moral witness, and people come to it because they have moral outrage about our immigration system. And observers serve to bring transparency and accountability to court, and put the court on notice that the public cares what is happening and is taking note. Observers monitor the impact of executive orders and policy changes and how those filter down to court. And in a really concrete way, we have impact because we can make referrals for representation. People in immigration court proceedings are not given an attorney. There's no public defender system. These are civil proceedings. We engage in dialogue with court. We give feedback. We raise important questions. And ultimately, our observations help inform education and advocacy efforts. Next slide. This is where it all takes place. The Bishop Henry Whipple Federal Building, which is right by the main airport. And the lower right slide shows immigration court. And you may notice a little video screen on the right-hand side. Since COVID, all the hearings are taking place via video conference. And so we're sitting in the courtroom watching proceedings on the little video screen. Next slide. So our observers take notes about factual things, you know, the gender, the country of origin, the language they speak, what happens during the hearing, but they also really have the ability to tell a narrative and tell a story. And I just want to share this quote because it's not unique. He's been in ICE custody over 2 years, states he came to the US as a stowaway and therefore Liberia won't issue travel documents and he can't be deported. Terribly unfair, they seem to be holding him indefinitely. No one seemed to take his mental health history and treatment into consideration. In fact, no one even responded when he talked about it. He took full responsibility and promised not to make those mistakes again. The system is broken if it offers no chance in situations like this. He works as a roofing contractor. ICE arrested him at work. So this is a common story that we hear. Next slide. One of the things the project does is put out reports to inform the public and policymakers of what we're seeing. And so I'm going to just show a little bit about 3 different recent reports. Next slide. So the most recent data report, I do these every 6 months, where we just look at what did we really record in the hearings that we observed. A previous one looked at mental health concerns in a deep way. This one was really looking at the first 6 months of the COVID pandemic and what we saw in court. And one of the things we saw, I don't expect you to be able to see the slide, but you can see the bar graphs, is that there were a lot more issues with language interpretation, technical problems, broken calls, failure to connect, and incomplete interpretation because we lost the ability to do simultaneous interpretation. So this really makes it much harder for people to understand what's happening and to participate in their trial. Next slide. One of the things we always look at are the people who give up, who, even though they might have a viable claim for relief from deportation, just say, deport me, I can't do this anymore. And one of the things we've seen is this seems a lot to be influenced by whether or not people have legal representation, if they have an attorney. So overall, about 40 to 45% of the hearings we see, people are speaking for themselves. They don't have an attorney. But when we look at people who give up and say, I can't do this anymore, 68, 71% say, don't have an attorney. And they're the ones who seem to give up. So our process is set up really to fail the people who are fighting for their freedom and fighting to stay in this country. Next slide. What I like to call our magnum opus is Bearing Witness in the Moment, and it's a report we put out in December. And this was not about observation data. This was interviews and reflections of court observers. So what motivated them to participate, what kept them going, and how did they make sense of what they were seeing? What impact did it have on them? What do they think works? And what do they think is broken? Next slide. And it's full of lots of quotes. And I think all the links to these are in the chat. If you have time, I really encourage people to look at it because it's a really compelling report. But one observer said, the stress of the entire situation, shackles, different language, stress of detention, pressure of the situation. I mean, there can't really be due process or justice. There's just too much stacked against them. Next slide. And so this really has impact on observers. We asked what kind of actions people had taken as a result, and really high activism, from contacting legislators to going to rallies, to educating people, to engaging in hard conversations, to donating money, because people were really compelled by what they saw. And really the report is structured because, independent of any prompting, observers identified international human rights standards and noted that they are lacking in immigration court. So a lack of just laws, fair process, non-discrimination, and a recognition of basic human dignity. And the report concludes with recommendations for the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the public for engagement. Next slide. And as Michelle mentioned, just released is Immigration, Detention, and COVID-19 in Minnesota. And I'll just point out this illustration was done during the pandemic, and you can see that people are sitting and watching, the detainee and the judge both appearing on the video screen. Next slide. This report drew heavily on court observer data, but it was a collaboration between the advocates so there were attorneys that weighed in, there were physicians that weighed in. Next slide. And the key findings were there are deficiencies in medical and mental health care, both in response to COVID-19 and just structurally in an ongoing way addressing medical and mental health issues. There's a failure of oversight and accountability among all the different players involved in immigration detention in Minnesota. There was a failure to follow a federal court order to individually evaluate the medical status of all people in ICE detention. There was a use of solitary confinement and lockdown as a substitute for basic COVID education and COVID precautions. And there were due process violations that really were barriers for people to participate in their own case, lack of access to counsel and barriers accessing documents and forms and resources. So that was a very, very quick overview. I'm gonna leave it there. so we can move on in our program. But really powerful. And I just want to express my gratitude to all the volunteers who've taken part in immigration court observation.
Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you. You're right. Every volunteer I'm seeing in the chat here, people talking about what you observed and really how that has affected you too. And we'd like to now to Florence Bremer, who has been an intrepid volunteer out at immigration court, about some of that impact and what you've witnessed. So Florence, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for coming here tonight. We really appreciate it. Zoom fatigue, it's a real thing. And you know, doing these things in the evening, it is something to be appreciated, and we do. I just wanted to talk a little bit about why I chose to be an observer and what it has meant to me. It's very easy when you hear the word observing to think it's a passive thing, that you're just passively observing. But observing is really a very active decision to see and an active decision to bear witness. And those are extremely powerful things. Way back when the UN started its court observation processes, that became clear. And even now during the time of COVID, you know, when an inhumane and unjust system has become even more cold and aloof, I think the act of observing is even more powerful. On a personal level, observing has given me such a fantastic opportunity to become more informed about immigration. When I started about 18 months ago, I was just a recently retired labor attorney, and there had been some intersection between immigration and worker issues. But you know, I really knew very little, and believe me, the learning curve is still quite steep. But this has provided me such a great opportunity to learn so much. And that, as Amy has said, has then become a springboard motivating me to do more citizen lobbying, giving, talking to friends and colleagues. But even beyond the personal level, I am convinced that observing has such a significant and substantive impact on judicial agents and processes, starting with the judge. The judge, often the observer, is the only person in the room other than the Department of Homeland Security attorney. And the judge sees us there. And you know, if they make a decision to be dismissive or to be disrespectful or to make rash conclusions without evidence having been presented, at least they're doing that knowing that someone is seeing that. And best case scenario, maybe they won't do that because they see us there. I think it's a profound, even the clerks. I have personally seen a difference in the way guards interact with detainees. And I have no reason to doubt that that might not be due in some part to observers being there. Then, of course, the Department of Homeland Security attorney. That's the attorney that's prosecuting the detainee and seeking deportation. They are sitting literally 6 feet in front of the observer, and they know we're watching every single thing and taking notes. And to the extent a detainee might have an attorney, which happens all too infrequently, and thank you so much to those attorneys out there tonight who are doing that. It's God bless you. I mean, you know, an observer being there, hopefully perhaps buoys their spirit in the often pro bono work they're doing. And then of course the detainees, when the detainees are there in person, they see us just literally 3 feet behind them. Now that they're on video, they can still see us in the courtroom. And just that feeling that they know that they are being seen means a lot. And back when families could be in the courtroom, if there were families, I know that they appreciated it as well. Now it's very, it's one thing to read about immigration. I know all of you are, I'm sure, very well read and well informed about what the media depicts about immigration, but to be there and to see the personal impact on these lives. Some of these people have literally been in the country since they were toddlers, never been in the country uh, to their memory, to which they are potentially going to be involuntarily deported. They may be in this country because they've been the subject of harassment based on GLBTQ status. I recently observed a case where a brother and an uncle had been killed by a gang because of dissenting activity. These are, so not only are we talking about the separation of families, which is heartbreaking, and the loss to the community of people who have been contributing to the community sometimes for decades, but we're also talking about potential involuntary deportation under extremely perilous situations. So observation, I've just appreciated it so much, this opportunity to be a firsthand observer of what is really going on and the need for immigration reform.
Thank you so much. And now, Joan Neymar, do you want to weigh in on what you've learned and what you want to share too?
Yes, sorry, I just lost the screen there for a second. I'm really pleased to be here and echo what's been said before, to be part of this greater community addressing this injustice in the U.S. immigration system. Amy asked me to talk about my commitment to this project, which is very deep, and its impact more broadly speaking. I've been a court observer for almost 3 years, a little after the program started. And that's when the headlines were just shouting at us about what was happening on the border. My faith community, First Universalist Church, works to address racial justice, and we became a sanctuary church immediately. My Italian grandparents came to the US over 100 years ago, and they were considered dirty and diseased. Does that sound somewhat familiar? And so these headlines and my personal and community connections pulled me into this work. I joined Amy at Immigration Court in June of 2017 and saw that injustice wasn't just at the border, it was right here in our backyard. I was all in, and it was something really manageable as a volunteer, as a layperson, and it felt like I was bearing witness to what was happening right here in Minnesota. I've been in courtroom 5, you saw the picture, at the Whipple building several weeks a month ever since, including throughout COVID. I've seen lots of changes in procedures and people, but I haven't seen an end to what I consider unjust outcomes in a really broken system. Amy calls me her #1 recruiter. I'm not sure if that's true, but I've introduced this program to dozens of people at my church and my friends and community, and many of you are here tonight. And to you, I say thank you. This work depends on volunteers to be the eyes and the ears and the heart of the community in general. New recruits in those early days always asked me, what happens to this data that we're collecting and sharing? Does it get stuck in some dusty database? And like, why are we even doing this? I mean, it's interesting and I can tell people about it, but where does it go? And my answer truthfully was that I wasn't sure, but to be patient and it would all become apparent over time. And clearly tonight is a testament that that was absolutely true. Also that telling our experiences to others helped combat the lack of awareness and all those untruths that were being told about immigrants. Tonight, we see what's happened because of this work, and you've heard some of that already. The data and reports based on our observations are shared with the judges at the Fort Snelling Court, and we see the result in the process changes. I think Florence spoke well about what our presence in the courtroom does. I've observed that. I'm 100% convinced that us just being a warm body in those benches really makes a difference. When appropriate, I can, to someone who's been granted bond but may not have money for it in the early days, you know, before last spring, a lot of people didn't have the money for those big bond amounts, but now I can share something about the Minnesota Freedom Fund to help with that funding. I have referred cases to the advocates, and that makes me feel great given those statistics about differential outcomes if someone has representation or not. And sometimes attorneys in the courtroom will, wave to me and ask for corroboration, what had just happened, or I'll say to them, did you know that the interpretation wasn't running at that moment? And so it tells me that we're a respected and useful part of this immigration court. I didn't expect that at first. I thought we'd just be invisible bumps. But I do more as a result of my immigration court experience. I've spent a lot more time than I ever expected learning about immigration laws, their history, and the differential impact on communities of color. So many Black and brown bodies are in ICE detention for minor or low-level infractions handed over by local law enforcement, that differential policing. And that's something we can act on. Through my church's Low Barrier Immigrant Fund, we support families impacted by ICE detention, folks who can't pay rent or someone's been deported and have other urgent needs. I'm watching the lawmakers right now. It's really delightful to we're particularly watching going in court every week can be addressed. This handing over of people for low-level infractions. I'm watching what the Biden administration is proposing and is actually doing, and watching federal members of Congress, what's going on in legislation. So we have voices and our stories are helpful. And I support the advocates. So thanks everyone for being here and for contributing. This is a trusted voice in the immigrant community when trusted voices are hard to find. It's not always possible that the government will be able to provide services to these communities when they are afraid of the government. It's an incredibly important organization. And so I will advocate, I will be heard, and ask those around me to do the same. Court observers get it. We know, we see what's happening out there and what needs to change. And we have credible and compelling stories. And we all know that stories influence public opinion and can enact systems change. And without my experience with the immigration court observers, I'd still just be reading headlines. So thanks for this opportunity to be part of this program.
And thank you, Joan. Thank you, Florence, and every observer, because this is what we do. We've gathered, we aren't passive bumps on a log, and we are learning and sharing and calling into question practices that for immigration lawyers who go into court every day become normalized. For the people who are being deported, it moves too fast to even stop and call things out. It has really been, for the advocates, the basis of a new vision of our immigration policy, of really trying policy work, really focused on dignity in migration and building a system that does not set traps, but creates a place where we can all thrive. At this point, I want to turn things over to Hannah Sanderson to have a quick conversation with one of the folks that she met for the first time in person after he was released very recently. She's been representing him for months. Hannah, over to you.
Awesome, thanks, Michelle. My name is Hannah Sanderson. I am one of the detention attorneys that receives all of your wonderful referrals and information, and it's extremely helpful. We're not able to be in court every day, and just the information that you gather is incredibly important for us to be able to represent people and find people that need our help. And I am far more boring than my client Marcelino, who is here today, so I want to turn the mic over to him. We'll try to just give a brief kind of summary of his time in detention. We could go on forever. We talked for an hour earlier today about it, but we'll try to keep it much shorter than that. So Sasha is going to be interpreting for Marcelino. He speaks Spanish. He just was released almost 2 weeks ago after almost a year in detention. So he won his case and is settling back into life in Minnesota, and wanted to share with you all his experience in detention and kind of his observations of other folks' experience as well. So Sasha, do you want to invite Marcelino to unmute himself?
Yes, Marcelino, bienvenidos. Estamos muy alegres de tenerte con nosotros por la noche. Me llamo Sasha, yo trabajo con Hannah Sanderson. y voy a traducir por ella por la noche. Yo creo que usted, yo creo que podemos escuchar tu voz. ¿Puedes decir algo, por favor, por nosotros?
Hola, hola, buenas tardes a todos.
Hello, everyone. Good evening to everyone.
Marcelino, thanks for being here today. Can you give us just a brief description of your time in Kandiyohi County Jail and what was kind of the most impactful thing for you while you were detained?
Marcelino, gracias por venir aquí. ¿Puedes compartir con nosotros tu experiencia en breve y el evento más significado por usted durante su tiempo en el cárcel de Kandiyohi?
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Marcelino García Vázquez. Permanecí casi un año en Kandiyohi, que es en Wilmer. Mi experiencia que tuve yo ahí, pues no se lo deseo a nadie, es una cosa fea, pero bueno, querían deportarme y gracias a la organización, gracias a la licenciada Ana, estoy libre.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marcelino. I remain almost 1 year in Kandiyohi, which is in Wilmer, Minnesota. While it is an ugly thing, my experience, I'm grateful for the organization that freed me.
Marcelino, you are, I know from experience, you're a very positive person, but you also mentioned that other people had a really challenging time in detention. Can you explain, what you saw people go through when they didn't have a lawyer?
Marcelino, yo sé que con mi experiencia con usted, yo sé que eres tú una persona muy positiva, pero yo sé que otras personas tenían una experiencia negativos y con eso puedes explicar un poco más sobre tu experiencia encarcelado en el cárcel de Kandiyohi, por favor.
Pues la experiencia que tuve mirando a las personas yo ahí, hay personas que sí tienen recursos para pagar abogado. También vi personas que no tienen recursos para pagar abogado, e incluso yo no soy una de las personas que no tuvo recursos para pagar un abogado. Gracias a la organización, gracias a ustedes, que abogados que nos gratuito, que nos ayudan a nosotros. Miré a mucha gente llorar porque se separan de su familia, se separan de sus hijos, de hijas, madres y padres. Es una situación muy dura, muy crítica en la cárcel. Hay personas que no tenían hermanos, no tenían esposa, no tenían a nadie con quien comunicarse afuera para que les ayudaran, y muchas personas pues sufrían por no tener personas que les ayuden y por no saber también que ustedes ayudan a las personas de bajos recursos que no tienen cómo pagar. También ellos no sabían muy bien de ustedes. Yo trataba de convencer, de decirles pues que hablaran con ustedes, a la organización, para que ayudaran.
While I was detained, there were two types of people: those who had resources to acquire the services of a lawyer and those who did not. There were often times when I would hear people crying, and like me, they did not have resources. They would cry out for their families. They would cry out for their loved ones. And sometimes some of them had no idea who to contact. And I would try and contact them and tell them about this organization. I would try to contact them about the lawyers who could potentially help them. And and I'm grateful for that.
I wish we had a lot more time to talk to you, Marcelino, but I just have one more question. You told me when you were released that you were really happy to be on the 5th floor of your hotel, that you could kind of see out over Minnesota and you hadn't seen outside for almost a year. And that was something that was really, that was really meaningful to hear. And I wonder, you also talked about food, being glad to have different food. So what was the food you were most excited to eat when you were released from detention?
Yo quiero tener más tiempo para hablar con usted, pero yo recuerdo cuando nosotros hablamos en el pasado que usted tenía mucho alegro de ser en el piso 5 del hotel, pero usted me dijo que al mismo tiempo usted estaba muy emocionada para tener la comida muy diferente. Pero yo quiero preguntarte qué tipo de la comida o qué comida estás emocionada para tener ahorita.
Pues el primer día que salí de la cárcel, me recibió una organización de una iglesia que me ayudaron, gracias a la licenciada Ana, que ella se encargó de buscar todas esas organizaciones para que me ayudaran.
Uh-huh.
Me dieron una bienvenida, pues, muy bien. Me llevaron a hacerme el test del COVID, me rentaron un hotel de 5 pisos, hasta lo alto estaba. Me sentía, pues, muy bien. Me dieron comida buena. No hubo ni una persona que no me hablara y me preguntara qué comida quería. Solo a una persona le dije que me comprara pescado frito. Eso es lo único. De lo demás, les dije que me llevaran lo que querían ellos y me comí todo, que hasta subí unos kilos más porque pues me llevaban suficiente comida y pues saliendo de la cárcel,
Uh-huh.
pues tenía ganas de comer y teniendo un hermoso paisaje, gracias a la licenciada que pues se encargó de buscarme todo y de darme una excelente comodidad para yo poder vivir.
Uh-huh. The first day I left the jail, I was greeted by people, especially Anna. So thanks to her and her church who assisted me. They helped me, as well as other people, rent a hotel, and it was 5 stories and I went up all the way to the sky. While I was there, no one asked me what I wanted except for one person, and they gave me fried fish. And so I kept eating and eating and eating, and it was so good.
Thank you, Marcelino, for sharing that with us, and congratulations on your freedom.
Gracias, señor Marcelino, por compartir esta información con nosotros. Felicidades de tener tu libertad ahorita.
Gracias a la licenciada y gracias a la organización de ayuda a emigrantes. Le deseo éxito y que sigan apoyando a la gente latina, como a este servidor que me apoyaron sin ningún gasto, sin ningún cobro, pues, pues gracias a Dios que les da pues ayuda y no sé cómo les ayuda a él, pero pues han tenido una hermosa y una linda organización y gracias por seguir ayudando a nosotros los latinos.
Thank you to the lawyers who work with these organizations that help asylum seekers and from people from Latin America. May God bless you. Thank you for your work, and I wish you success and I wish you prosperity as you continue your work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Marcelino. It is so good to meet you finally. And thank you everyone for helping us remember that we don't do any of our work to improve laws, to try to make the courts better without a real reason. And it's because human beings spend years of their lives without seeing fresh air, without seeing the sunlight, without a chance at a fair day in court to live their lives. And we're so glad that you're part of this work with us. I'm going to turn things over to Robin, who's going to wrap things up for us. Robin Phillips, I will give you the mic here.
Great. And I even remembered to unmute. So Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Marcelino. Your story is so inspiring to us. And thank you, Florence and Joan and Amy, for sharing. It just is so important for all of us to understand the experiences and to publicly thank you. We're so grateful for all you do. Tonight, we are here. We welcome this moment where change is possible. And we know that we collectively have the power to make positive change. We can hold our government accountable for its treatment of immigrants in detention centers. We can hold it accountable for the unnecessarily complicated legal system that is nearly impossible for an asylum seeker to navigate without an attorney. We can hold it accountable for its failure to provide legal representation when the outcome in many cases is a matter of life and death. Most importantly, we can demand that the immigration system respects the dignity of every person it encounters. This year, Congress is considering numerous bills to reform our immigration laws. While some of the bills include promising proposals, too many continue to entrench harmful exclusionary provisions. We know that the road to passing meaningful immigration reform is difficult, but the changes must break down the built-in racism in our current system and create a welcoming community for all. It takes court observers bearing witness and collecting data on what is happening. It takes attorneys commenting on the proposed legal changes. It takes community members holding their elected officials accountable for reforms that reflect human rights principles. And it takes money to support all of these efforts. So tonight, we ask you to give whatever is meaningful for you. If you can give $1,000 to provide legal representation to an unaccompanied child or a detained immigrant separated from their family, please do so. If you can give $100 for a brief consultation, postage, and phone calls, please do so. If you can give $25, we greatly appreciate it. If you are able to give $25 a month to sustain the work, please sign up now. Please know that your support matters. Generous volunteers are matching donations tonight up to $7,000. Please help us meet this challenge. Now, in contrast to the complicated immigration court, giving money is very simple. I was told to hold up my phone as a prop, but you can text to give tonight. Just simply text advocates, ADVOCATES, to 243-725 on your phone and donate, or you can send a check, or you can donate online. It's secure. Whatever works, we really appreciate. And whatever you give tonight, we thank you. We appreciate you, and we are looking forward to the day when we can celebrate a just and equitable system, and maybe even celebrate in person.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We invite you to move to our breakout rooms that Liz is going to be opening here. Each room is hosted by one of our court observers. You'll see their names, so feel free to move between rooms, head out at any time. This is really a chance for informal conversation, answering questions, getting to know one another or reconnect. And please join us for other events this spring in our Power in the Moment series. On March 24th, we will be having Envision the Future of Women's Human Rights. On April 22nd, we will look at what has changed and what hasn't in advancing immigration reform 90 days into the Biden administration. And on May 4th, we will be exploring advocacy from local to global with our international advocacy team. So thank you so much. Just huge gratitude to everyone. And please jump into a breakout room. Have a wonderful night, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.